About adoption during that meeting, and there was no follow-up and no documents being offered. Now, during the transition, he says he again met with Ambassador Kislyak, who wanted to address U.S. policy in Syria and requested a secure line to conduct that conversation with people in Moscow. Kushner says he asked in response if it was possible to use communication channels at the Russian embassy, which he says didn't happen. And after that, at Kislyak's request, he met with Sergei Gorkov, the head of the Russian state-owned bank VEB, who has a direct connection to Russian President Vladimir Putin. Kushner says that meeting lasted about 20 minutes, and he claims it was only about relationship building and that no personal business was discussed. It's important to point out that contradicts a statement from VEB that says the meeting was about Kushner's business. But it is clear, Allison and Chris, in this 11-page statement, that he is trying to downplay these contacts with Russians he had during the campaign and transition, saying that really they were insignificant in his view. And it's also a defense of why he had these meetings in the first place. Of course, he will be peppered with questions when he goes behind closed doors on Capitol Hill later this morning.
Yes, that will be fascinating. Pamela, thanks so much for laying all of that reporting out for us. So the House and Senate reaching a deal on a new Russia sanctions bill, but it is not clear whether President Trump will sign it, given that it aims to limit his ability to ever weaken those sanctions. CNN's Joe Johns is live at the White House with more. What have you learned about their take on it there, Joe?
Allison, wasn't long ago that the White House was opposed to key provisions in that bill to punish Russia for meddling in the last election. Now pressures mounting on Capitol Hill to do something. The president finding himself in a tough spot, a no-win situation, if you will. Meanwhile, the newly minted White House communications team over the weekend was getting signals crossed trying to explain it. President Trump's new communications team offering muddled messaging about whether the president supports a bill that will limit his ability to unilaterally lift sanctions on Moscow. Newly appointed Press Secretary Sarah Huckabee Sanders signaling the president is open to signing the legislation.
The administration is supportive of being tough on Russia, particularly in putting these sanctions in place, and we support where the legislation is now.
But incoming White House Communications Director Anthony Scaramucci sounding more uncertain.
Is President Trump going to sign the Russian sanctions bill?
We got to ask President Trump that. You know, it's my second or third day on the job. My guess is that he's going to make that decision shortly.
The new communications director also telling CNN that President Trump still does not accept that Russia attempted to influence the 2016 election.
He basically said to me, hey, you know, this is, maybe they did it, maybe they didn't do it.
A stark contrast to the unanimous and unwavering beliefs reiterated by President Trump's own intelligence officials in the last week.
There is no dissent, and I have stated that publicly.
Everyone's on board.
And I stated it to the president.
I am confident that the Russians meddled in this election, as is the entire intelligence community.
No doubt at all, and I stand behind the intelligence community assessment that we produced.
With three of his inner circle scheduled this week to speak with congressional investigators looking into possible collusion between the Trump campaign and Russia, the president unleashing his anger at both political parties, once again calling the investigation a phony witch hunt and an excuse for a lost election, while attacking fellow Republicans for doing very little to protect their president. The president raising eyebrows a day earlier by asserting he has the complete power to pardon, suggesting that might include his family, his aides, even possibly himself in relation to the Russia probe.
I'm in the Oval Office with the president last week. We're talking about that. He says he brought that up. He says, but he doesn't have to be pardoned. There's nobody around him that has to be pardoned.
One of President Trump's lawyers offering a contradictory message.
We have not and continue to not have conversations with the President of the United States regarding pardons. Pardons have not been discussed, and pardons are not on the table.
Now, the House is expected to take up that sanctions bill as early as Tuesday. The New York Times reporting that when they reached out to Scaramucci about the confusion over where the president stands on the bill, he said he was still new to the information. Chris and Allison.
All right, let's bring in the panel. Joe, thank you very much. CNN political analyst David Drucker, Washington Post congressional reporter Karun Demirjian, and CNN military and diplomatic analyst Rear Admiral John Kirby. So, Mr. Drucker, when you see this 11-page statement, Kushner is saying, here is the truth from my perspective. I was overwhelmed. I may have been naive, but I wasn't dirty. He seems to be leveraging that. You want to criticize me politically? Go ahead, but I wasn't doing anything dirty. What do you think of it?
Well, I think that he's finally put some meat on the bones, and I think so much of the problems that they have had in terms of this Russia issue and all of the drip, drip, drip that we've seen in news reports over the past 6-7 months is that they haven't disclosed so many of their contacts and so many of their meetings, particularly with Russian individuals and Russian officials, such that it made it appear as though they were trying to hide things. I mean, General Flynn, the National Security Advisor, was fired because he wasn't truthful with his boss. He left the vice president hung out to dry. I think the one thing that they should get away from is this naivete about, look, we were high-powered, very successful, intelligent business people running all sorts of operations, but we weren't smart enough to get this political thing. I mean, by the time the particular Russian meeting happened in June of 2016, they'd been running for president for a year. They had Don McGahn on staff from the very beginning. He's now the White House counsel, but he was the campaign counsel. He's one of the smartest, most effective Republican election lawyers in Washington.
So why didn't he tell them some of this protocol?
Well, who knows whether he told them or not, but my point is they had available to them the expertise. And I've covered a lot of businessmen turned politicians. Now, granted, running for president is a little bit different than running for the United States Senate or running for governor, but there are rules in running for governor in particular states. There are rules in running for Senate, and I've seen these business people hire people that know politics, as Mr. Trump did, and then they start to rely on their expertise so that they do everything according to federal law. And so I think that they like to play the naivete card when it's convenient for them. That it doesn't help their case, number one, and it doesn't add up if that's what they're going to rely on.
Yeah, John Kirby, you know, it's not just naivete. I mean, he also pleads just being overwhelmed and busy, that he was getting 200 emails a day. He couldn't read through all of them. He certainly couldn't read through all the threads. So this meeting, in other words, was in his schedule. The meeting with the Russian attorney that Don Jr.'s emails were about was in Jared's schedule as Don Jr. meeting. That's it. That's what he thought he was. He didn't know what he was walking into, as depicted by his statement here. So, in terms of how the Russians were approaching this team, what do you see in here?
One of the things that leaped off the pages of this statement to me was if you take it at face value, is the frenetic, almost enthusiastic aggressiveness by the Russians to get in the ground floor here with this campaign. And then after they won, certainly as a transition team, you keep seeing Kislyak repeatedly calling to get meetings on the schedule and really reaching out. So you see this. So one of the big takeaways is this confirms what we all knew was a very active Russian effort to get involved here with Trump campaign and Trump post-election activities. The other thing I wanted to add to what David was saying was, don't forget the State Department, and I was part of the State Department during the transition, we repeatedly reached out to the Trump transition team and offered assistance and advice and counsel and background materials for any and all foreign contacts that they were having, and we were rebuffed at every turn. This statement is pretty much him giving the Heisman to knowing anything about how to deal with foreign governments. But we were there. We were ready to support them, and they continually turned us down.
You got ignorance, and then you have what they call willful ignorance, which is where, because you didn't want to deal with the John Kirby or the Obama administration or the existing institutions, you wound up walking blindly into situations. At best, by the way, that would still be a best reckoning. So, Karun, that's going to put the challenge now on the investigators. All right, this is what Kushner wants them to believe. What do you think the questions are that come out of this statement?
Well, the statement addresses and confirms many of the facts that we had reported earlier and that we knew that the investigators were going to want to talk about the existence of certain meetings, about the fact that he did have contacts with Russians that did not initially show up on his disclosure form. But the question is going to be now one of motivation and one of takeaways and everything else that went around outside of where there's a paper trail and documented meetings and phone calls. Why did Kushner agree to have these meetings in the first place? What was it he was seeking to get out of them? What was the follow-up? The way it's presented presented in this statement makes it seem a lot like it was just kind of bumbling, but is that actually the case? And that's what investigators are going to be drilling down into, because, okay, you can establish that certain meetings happened, but really was there nothing except for this forwarded email chain between Don Jr. and Kushner that led to the June 2016 meeting? Was there really absolutely no follow-up that maybe wasn't in a paper form, between other members of the campaign potentially and Kushner about what happened in certain ones of these meetings? I think investigators are going to try to drill down to everything that happened surrounding what we now know there's a fairly agreed upon record of having taken place, and that's really going to drive what sorts of conclusions they draw. If they agree with Kushner that it is just all a series of errors, or if they think there's something more nefarious there.
David, Jared reveals in this 11-page statement that about that meeting with the Russian attorney about Don Jr.'s emails, he found that meeting so irrelevant, so superfluous to anything that was happening in their daily lives, that he staged basically a diversion with his assistant and said, please texted her, get me out of here, I'm paraphrasing, call me, I want to get out of this meeting. So he arrived late and left early from this meeting with the what he claims was about adoption. There's no sense, of course, that the Russians might have been playing them. I mean, no sense of what the Russians wanted. They thought it was adoption, which, of course, now we believe is synonymous with sanctions relief.
Right. Well, look, I mean, they've talked about this meeting being about adoption, but at least for the organizer of the meeting, Don Jr., he knew there was more to it than that. And I think that...
Or should have known.
Well, the heading of the email suggested that there was more to it.
Because he says, I didn't know. I didn't really know.
Right, Kushner didn't know, but...
Right, so does Don Jr., though. I mean, that is his ostensible defense, which is, I just went in there, it was a friend, I had a meeting, you know what I mean? He should have known.
Right, but he was promised dirt on Hillary Clinton.
Right, yeah. He should have known.
Look, I think that it's all very plausible that you're running a presidential campaign. You're running from meeting to meeting. You don't ask a lot of questions. I suppose that's possible, and I could see that happening because this is Don Jr. This is not some random campaign flack saying, please jump into a meeting. So you do it without asking. I think the important thing to understand here is right now, and this was very smart of Jared Kushner, we're all talking about the facts he's provided and the statement that he's written. The members of the Senate Intelligence Committee know a lot more, at least more than we know, to some extent. Same with maybe possibly members of the Senate Judiciary Committee. So they're going to ask very pointed questions, probably based on facts we don't know. And I think that could have a large effect as to whether this statement generally is the last word on this or not.
Well, and it's going to be in private, so we'll have to see what comes out about it. He made this public, which was a smart move. John Kirby, let me ask you about something else. The sanctions bill that the Senate seems to hold in pretty bipartisan fashion, right? You had 98-2 on your vote. The president, now we know again from Anthony Scaramucci, we don't have to speculate about it, the president hears Russian interference. In his mind, it says illegitimacy. That's the way he takes it. That's why he won't accept the intel on it. He doesn't like it. That's why he calls us all a witch hunt and a hoax, even though it seemed pretty clear from the email chain that his son put out that the Russians wanted to have some meetings and see what they could get done. So all of that leads us to this sanctions bill. As Allison was saying earlier, sanctions is what the Russians are worried about. If he goes along with this sanctions bill, which his party wants him to do, they may override his veto in this first piece of major legislation that reached his desk. If he doesn't sign it, what does it box him into if he signs it?
If he signs it, it's basically a tacit admission that he agrees the Russian government meddled in the election, because the sanctions are designed to punish them for exactly that offense. So, look, I think it's silly and small that he won't admit that the Russians meddled in the election when everybody else in the universe seems to understand this. And I agree with you, Chris. I think it's really just about ego. What I'm more concerned about is his actions going forward. A, in terms of holding them to account and hopefully signing this bill. And B, don't forget, what actions is the government taking to protect our 2018 elections and then the 2020 ones after that? Those are really the more important issues. But I agree. If he signs this thing without a fight, that's a tacit admission that he agrees.
Puts his supporters in a box also, because, even this morning, supporters are saying, well, you don't know that for sure. Well, Scaramucci talked to him, and that's what he said. But I'll tell you what, if I'm one of his supporters, I take that rationale, I still think this is about my legitimacy as president, so I'm not going along with it until I see absolute proof. I'll take that over the alternative, because what's the alternative? If he's not ignoring what is known about the interference because he thinks it's politically damaging, then why isn't he admitting it?
Look, the last time we saw a president faced with whether or not to sign a sanctions bill, it was President Obama, and it was the Congress, Democrats and Republicans, pushing him on Iran sanctions. So this isn't exactly unprecedented, but this is very early in Donald Trump's presidency. It would be a major rebuke if he vetoed and it was overridden.
Okay, panel, thank you very much. It'll be interesting to see how all of that plays out this week. So President Trump still not convinced that Russia meddled in the U.S. election, despite what his own intel officials say. So we have a Republican congressman on next to explain how that works.